Welcome back to another edition of the 6Ps podcast. Today we're going to be focusing on the theme of outsiders in both Arthur Miller's play The Crucible and Rosalie Ham's novel The Dressmaker as part of our comparing text unit of VCE English and EAL. So in terms of vocabulary, outsiders are, I guess, those people who do not fit in or don't conform to a society's values or expectations, and we're also thinking about those who sit on the periphery of society or at the edge of the society. So when it comes to vocabulary, it's really important, again, we don't want to keep referring to these characters as, say, outsiders. It's really important that we vary our vocabulary to show the markers and the assessors our broad, complex and sophisticated vocabulary. So phrases or terms like outcasts, nonconformists, those who are isolated, those who are rejects or ostracized and excluded from society. These are all really good ways of saying this without really repeating yourself. And again, it might be an idea to go out on your own and branch out and find even more words or terms and phrases that you can use to describe outsiders. So what I want you to do is have a think about who are the outsiders in these texts. Who are those people on the periphery of society, those who don't conform to the social codes and conventions. And hopefully already you're thinking about a couple of the key characters, particularly the protagonists. So let's start with The Crucible, where we have characters like Tituba. We've also got Sarah Good, Goody Osborne, even Bridget Bishop, and there is absolutely no coincidence that these are the characters that are initially blamed for the crisis within Salem. We've also got Abigail, who we would consider a bit of an outsider, particularly in the beginning of the texts, and of course John Proctor, our protagonist, but the list is far from over from here. In terms of outsiders, we have of course Reverend Hale and Judge Danforth, who come from outside of Salem, but would we consider them outcasts? Well, potentially to an extent in certain parts of the text, but they definitely hold more power than the other characters. And what about Reverend Parris, someone who only has just arrived in Salem, who was fearful of his enemies and the factions that were sworn to drive him from the pulpit, to quote Act 1 of The Crucible? And what about Elizabeth Proctor as well, who of course is targeted by Abigail in the text? When it comes to the dressmaker, Tilly is the most obvious character to choose from. Again, she literally arrives from outside the town to begin with in the text, but she's definitely considered an outcast by many. So too is her mother, Molly. In fact, they're both often judged together. The McSwineys I would also consider outsiders. They are, of course, a lower class family. And what is interesting to note is that Tilly, Molly, the Dunnages, as well as the McSwineys, live separate to the rest of the town. You've also got Sergeant Farrett as well, who maintains or hides his secret desires. These primarily revolve around fashion and cross-dressing. So he too is an outsider when you consider, I guess, the traditional expectations of people in rural 1950s. But again, the list is far from over. You could consider characters like Mona and Leslie, who are outsiders within their own family, and to an extent in the community as well. But once again, this list should be, I guess, a bit of a snapshot, but I would definitely encourage you to go out and formulate your own list or build on this list and look at who the other characters are who you might consider to be outsiders. So, why do we consider these characters as outsiders? What traits or qualities or reasons are there why they are considered as such? And I think it comes down to the fact that these are characters who do not conform to the social codes, conventions and expectations, and as a result would be considered outsiders or outcasts, and also characters who as a result of this are ostracized by their respective communities. So, going through this list again, try and find those quotations which help support these ideas. So Tituba is definitely an outsider because she is a slave. We know that quote from the stage directions that outlines that trouble in this house often landed on her back, and that's why she's so frightened. With Sarah Good and Goody Osborne, their traits are described by Elizabeth Proctor. She doesn't sleep in ditches, or she isn't drunk either, like these characters are. You've got Abigail Williams, who is 17 and an orphan. So again, she's young. She's also a woman as well. And she's a servant too, I should say, much like a character such as Mary Warren. John Proctor would also be considered an outsider, and I've got the quote from the authorial interjection from Act 1, where he's described as being a sinner against the moral fashion of the time. So again, he goes against those social conventions of Puritanism, but also he doesn't particularly abide by all the expectations and all the rules of Puritan Salem. So he doesn't go to church every week. He has been seen ploughing in the field on the Sabbath, and of course he can't name all 10 of the commandments when questioned by Reverend Hale in Act 2. What about the dressmaker? Well, Tilly is a bastard, so she is an illegitimate child, as is described in the text. She's also labelled a murderess or a murderer, as well as a witch. Mad Molly, yes, she's called Mad Molly several times. She's also called a hag and a slut, not just by the adults, but also by the children. It's important to note that having a child out of wedlock would have been looked down upon during that time, particularly in a conservative rural community such as Dungatar. Hence why both her and Tilly are considered as outsiders. In fact, Tilly is sent away and Molly is abandoned and ostracised up on the hill between Tilly leaving and Tilly coming back. It is only May and Irma that really look after her. Even Sergeant Farrett doesn't, and he feels quite guilty about that when discussing this with Tilly. The McSwaney. So interestingly, we've got two. Well, I'll focus firstly on Teddy. Now, Bueller describes him as a bludger and a thief, but he's actually described as being an outcast until he proved himself an asset. That comes up on page 197 during Sergeant Farrett's sermon. So the fact that he was a very talented footy player, avoid watching the film with Liam Hemsworth. He doesn't quite know how to kick a drop punt, but it's the fact that he can play football and win them grand finals, win them flags, that eventually allows him to be accepted by society. Yet, what's interesting is he doesn't seem to care what they think. A little bit like, well, not quite like Tilly, who does seem to care, particularly in the beginning of the text, but he doesn't seem to care about what others think of him. Hence, he goes places with her. And of course, we have Sergeant Farrett, which we mentioned before, his unique outfits, which he only wore inside the house. And that's described in the first section of the text. So I want you to have a think about how these characters are treated as a result of being labelled as outcasts. So some are ostracised and abandoned by their communities, and I think this is a really pertinent point when it comes to Mad Molly. Others are scapegoated and blamed. Again, this is really prominent in the Crucible, I would think. We're talking about Tituba, Sarah Good, Bridget Bishop, Goody Osborne. They definitely are looked at by others, looked down upon, by others, and are easy targets to blame. Some characters are abused and even killed. So again, we see Tilly being abused. On the other hand, John Proctor is ultimately killed for being an outsider in this community and refusing to conform to what others want him to do. Some of these characters are judged and labelled. Others challenge authority. I think characters like Giles Corey and Rebecca Nurse would be really good to look at here. Again, they refuse to confess to witchcraft and instead essentially sacrifice their lives. I think Giles Corey particularly feels quite guilty about the way that he accidentally condemned his wife, and again he's pressed to death. There are others though that are able to rise to power. They're able to manipulate the fears pervading these societies. So Abigail Williams is perfect here. We know, of course, that ultimately Abigail does flee after robbing Reverend Parris, of course, but it's interesting to note how she is able to rise to power given the fact that she is a young woman, and, of course, she was dancing. And the fact that Reverend Parris knows that as well, the fact that Reverend Hale knows that, yet that is not used as evidence against her character, is something, again, you can look at when it comes to, say, themes such as hypocrisy. So what else should you consider when it comes to the theme of outsiders? And again, I'm looking at this next level analysis. So have a think about the setting. Have a think about social status, particularly those of lower class, and think about gender roles too, particularly given that these are two patriarchal societies where men have most, if not all, of the power. Think also about the geographic location. I think what's interesting to note is characters like Tilly, Molly, the McSwineys live on the edge of the community away from the consensus. Think too about John Proctor. He lives a little bit away from the town. But think too about how some of these outsiders are quite close to people of power. Take, for example, Tituba and Abigail, who work in the Paris household. They are within close proximity. And of course, both Tituba and Abigail end up threatening Reverend Paris, which is a real reversal of the social hierarchy in that town. Think about the language and the labels that are used, particularly in the Dressmaker. These are what characters call other people. In the Crucible, it's more so through Arthur Miller's explicit descriptions of characters through stage directions, and of course, the authorial interjections. And also think about symbols such as dancing, clothing, and fire. Again, I won't go into much detail here, but definitely would compel you all to think about what these or how these might be connected to the idea of being an outsider and being an outcast. So let's have a think about some key ideas once again for this theme. So what messages do the text teach us about outsiders and those who are ostracised by their respective communities? Have a think about writing down some statements which explore these different ideas. And again, that phrase which I always like to start with, that both texts examine, explore, or depict what about outsiders. Here are some examples you might want to have a look at. The fact that both texts explore hypocritical and abusive leaders who suppress and torment outcasts. The fact or the idea that both texts portray vulnerable citizens who sit on the periphery of tight-knit communities as the initial targets of blame. So connecting blame to the idea of outcasts. The fact that both texts examine those with privileged positions in society, persecuting the vulnerable. Very similar, of course, to the first idea. The next one, that both texts explore outsiders overcoming social contracts and gaining power. Again, we're sort of thinking a little bit about Abigail Williams there. The idea that both texts suggest those who do not conform to social norms within these communities are labelled as outcasts and shunned. And the idea that both texts depict insular communities devoid of individualism. And again, this idea about conformity or a lack of conformity, or the result of those who are excluded by society who do not conform to the general consensus. So when it comes to paragraph writing, of course, we've got this little structure we've been looking at a couple of times now. This is sort of a basic way that you might like to structure your writing. Again, the main thing is that you're looking at both the similarities and the differences, especially if you're aiming for a really complex piece of writing. And of course, you want to be writing about both texts evenly. So let's have a look at a sample paragraph written by Lindsay Dang. The ways in which the respective societies suppress individual freedom is also thoroughly critiqued by Ham and Miller. From the outset of the play, Miller employs the motif of dancing as a statement against the restrictive and autocratic authority that governs Salem and persecutes outcasts. Given that children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight, it can be inferred that the girls' act of dancing like heathens in the forest showcases their desire for freedom and release of suppression, though their extreme fear of being whipped, one that manifests into a spiritual sickness, establishing the ways in which the society criminalises any acts of expression. Though Dungatar is set in a completely different time and location, the same norms are exhibited. Sergeant Farrett's unconventional passion for cross-dressing is also one that is stigmatised by the society that he lives, resulting in him being able to wear them only inside the house. His constant fear of being judged for his personality, reflected by his unique haute couture outfits, highlights the way in which his individualism is suppressed by the society. Both the Crucible and the Dressmaker foreground the restrictive nature of communities that forbid expression and demand absolute conformity, challenging the audience to emulate their distaste towards these archaic and conservative ways of living. So here we've got the idea of individual freedom, And that's been, I guess, connected to the idea of outcasts. And we've got the girls and Sergeant Farrett here as our examples. Again, we see the similarities here. We see the fact that there's similar norms within both societies, and the fact that we have those willing to, I guess, break them, but again, in different ways. All right, now it's over to you. Have a think or consider some of the ideas and statements that were mentioned previously, and have a go at writing paragraphs on these. You might also want to explore the characters in a little bit more detail. Perhaps you might make a table of each character who is considered an outsider and discuss why this is the case and what the consequences of this are. I'd also definitely compel many of you to have a look at the language, the style and the structural features of both texts, and work out maybe some symbols that you can connect to this idea. Again, don't forget that proper prior preparation prevents poor performance.